In the salt-stained air of Millhaven, Oregon, a struggling single father was about to inherit more than just crumbling walls. What started as a reluctant visit to a decaying Victorian mansion took a shocking turn when they came face to face with a real estate agent who mocked his financial situation. Caleb Turner wasn't your typical inheritance recipient. For 4 years, he had spent his life working 2 part-time jobs after losing his wife to cancer. Known for his quiet determination to provide for his 15-year-old daughter Maya. When they encountered the weathered mansion perched on the cliff's edge, he had no idea he was walking into a century-old mystery that would challenge everything he believed about his family's past. Caleb discovered a sealed letter from his estranged father that would lead to an $80 million maritime trust and a lighthouse that had been secretly protecting the community for generations. What began as pressure to sell quickly to developers would become a battle for his family's true legacy. The coastal town of Millhaven would never be the same after the Sentinel Lighthouse burned bright once again, proving that some inheritances are worth more than money, they're worth fighting for. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Sometimes the hardest battles we face aren't against others, but against our own broken expectations. Caleb Turner understood this truth as he stood in the salt-stained air, staring at the Victorian mansion that everyone said would ruin him. The weathered shingles stretched before him like a monument to decay. Storm-bent trees clawed at broken gutters. Windows stared back like clouded eyes, their glass streaked with decades of coastal rain. His 15-year-old daughter, Maya, kicked at loose stones in the overgrown driveway, her curiosity stronger than the building's obvious neglect. The neighbors had made their feelings clear. He was foolish for keeping this worthless inheritance when bills were piling up, and practical matters demanded attention. But something in Maya's excited voice, as she pointed to the intricate carvings above the attic windows, made him pause. She saw possibility where others saw problems. What if this crumbling structure held more than just rot and memories? What if the very thing everyone mocked him for might change everything? Caleb Turner had never imagined his life would look like this. 4 years ago, he'd been standing in front of a classroom full of high school sophomores, teaching American history with the passion of someone who believed the past could guide the future. Rebecca would pick him up after school in their reliable Subaru, and they'd drive home together, talking about their day, planning weekend adventures with Maya, dreaming about the house they'd buy when they saved enough for a down payment. On call, now the Subaru was gone, sold to pay for medical bills that insurance wouldn't cover. Rebecca was gone too, taken by cancer that moved faster than anyone expected. And Caleb found himself living in a cramped apartment on the wrong side of Millhaven, Oregon, working 2 part-time jobs, stocking shelves at the grocery store before dawn, and tutoring kids after school, just to keep food on the table and a roof over their heads. The apartment sat in a complex built in the 1970s, where the lucky folks lived who couldn't quite afford houses but hadn't given up entirely. Caleb's unit was clean but cramped, with thin walls that let in every sound from the neighbors and a kitchen window that looked out onto the parking lot where teenagers gathered to smoke and play music too loud for his taste. Maya handled the transition better than he did. At 15, she possessed her mother's optimism and an imagination that could transform their small space into archaeological dig sites or research stations, depending on the day's adventure. She'd inherited Rebecca's dark hair and quick smile, but her eyes, those were pure Caleb, deep brown and thoughtful, always searching for the story behind the story. "Dad, look at this," Maya called from the mansion's front steps, where she'd been examining the carved details while he fumbled with the keys the attorney had given him. The building loomed above them, 3 stories of faded grandeur and broken promises. These aren't random decorations. See how they're all maritime symbols? Anchors, compass roses, sailing ships? Caleb squinted at the weathered carvings she was tracing with her finger. To him, they looked like expensive maintenance waiting to happen. But Maya had always seen things differently. Patterns in clouds, faces in wallpaper, stories in the way shadows fell across their kitchen table. Now the Subaru was gone, sold to pay for medical bills that insurance wouldn't cover. Rebecca was gone too, taken by cancer that moved faster than anyone expected. And Caleb found himself living in a crossing. "It's probably just typical Victorian excess, honey," he said, though something about the deliberate precision of the nautical motifs made him pause. "Your grandfather never mentioned anything special about decorative details." That wasn't entirely true. Samuel Turner had been Caleb's father, a man who'd grown increasingly distant after Rebecca's death, keeping to himself for most of his 76 years. He'd worked as a marine engineer before retiring to this cliffside estate, but had somehow managed to hold on to the property when the rest of the coastal properties were being bought up by developers in the 2010s. During their infrequent visits, Samuel would sometimes get a distant look when talk turned to the old house. He'd mention how their family had lived here for generations, though he was always vague about details. When pressed, he'd change the subject or excuse himself to check on something in the garden. The funeral had been small, just Caleb, Maya, and a handful of Samuel's neighbors from town. The lawyer's reading of the will had been even smaller. Everything went to Caleb, including a mansion that the property assessor valued at roughly the cost of the demolition it would require. "Why would Grandpa leave us a house that nobody wants?" Maya had asked on the drive over. "Maybe he thought we could sell it," Caleb had replied, though even then he'd suspected there was more to it. Samuel had been eccentric, but he wasn't foolish. If he'd wanted to leave them money, he would have sold the place himself. Now, standing in the afternoon mist, with salt spray stinging his cheeks, Caleb wondered if his father had been playing a longer game. The building was old, much older than the 1890s construction date listed in the county records. The architectural details didn't match the typical Victorian homes built during Oregon's timber boom. The foundation stones looked hand-cut, not poured concrete. The lighthouse tower attached to the north side suggested maritime purposes beyond simple residence. "Dad, there's someone coming up the drive," Maya called, pointing toward a gleaming SUV navigating the potholes. The vehicle stopped behind Caleb's battered pickup truck, and out stepped a woman in her 40s, wearing a sharp business suit and an expression that suggested she'd been waiting for this moment. Her blonde hair was perfectly styled, despite the coastal wind, and she carried herself with the confidence of someone who made her living convincing people to make decisions they weren't sure about. "Mr. Turner, I'm Iris Moreno, Coastal Properties Real Estate." She extended a manicured hand and a bright smile. "I was so sorry to hear about your father's passing." Samuel was quite the character around town. Caleb accepted the handshake warily. "Thank you, though I'm not sure we're ready to discuss." "Oh, I completely understand," Iris interrupted smoothly. "Grief takes time. But I wanted to reach out as soon as possible because I have a client who's very interested in this property. Very interested." She gestured toward the mansion with practiced enthusiasm. "Derek Lang. Perhaps you've heard of him? He's developing several luxury projects along the coast, and this location would be perfect for his vision." Maya stepped closer to her father, sensing the conversation's direction. "I'm not looking to sell right now," Caleb said carefully. Iris's smile never wavered. "Of course not. But Mr. Turner, can I speak frankly? This property is a money pit. The foundation needs work, the roof is shot, and the electrical system is probably a fire hazard. Winter storms hit this cliff hard. The maintenance costs alone could bankrupt a family." She paused, letting that sink in. "Mr. Lang is prepared to offer well above market value. Enough to set up a proper college fund for your daughter here, maybe get you back on your feet." Caleb felt the familiar knot in his stomach, the same one that appeared whenever someone mentioned Maya's future and his ability to provide for it. Iris had done her homework. "How much above market value?" he asked, hating himself for the question. $2 million, Iris said simply. "Cash. Close in 30 days. Maya's sharp intake of breath was audible. $2 million would solve every problem they had, and create opportunities Caleb had stopped allowing himself to imagine. "That's very generous," he said slowly. "But I'd like to look around first, get a sense of what my father left us." "Absolutely," Iris agreed. "Take your time. But don't take too long. Mr. Lang has other properties he's considering, and this kind of offer doesn't stay on the table indefinitely." She handed him a business card with gold embossing. "Call me when you're ready to move forward. Trust me, Mr. Turner. This is the smart choice." She walked back to her SUV with the measured pace of someone who knew she'd planted the right seeds. As her taillights disappeared down the winding drive, Caleb stared at the business card in his hand. $2 million, Maya said quietly. $2 million, Caleb echoed. They stood in silence for a moment, both calculating what that money could mean. Then Maya looked up at the mansion's weathered facade. at the carved nautical symbols that had caught her attention, at the lighthouse tower that seemed to be watching the darkening sea. "Dad," she said, "what if Grandpa left us this place for a reason?" Before Caleb could answer, the wind picked up, sending a low moan through the mansion's eaves that sounded almost like a warning. The front door of the mansion opened with the grudging creak of hinges that hadn't moved in months. Caleb pushed it wide, and he and Maya stepped into a world that smelled of dust, salt air, and something else. Something that reminded him of his childhood visits, though he couldn't quite place it. Old wood, lemon oil, the faint trace of pipe tobacco that had been Samuel's constant companion. The entry hall stretched before them, its hardwood floors dulled by neglect but still showing hints of their former glory. A staircase curved upward to the second floor, its banister carved with the same nautical motifs they'd noticed outside. Weak afternoon light filtered through grime-covered windows, casting everything in sepia tones that made the space feel like a photograph from another era. "It's like a museum," Maya whispered, her voice echoing in the vast space. She was right. Despite the dust and obvious abandonment, the mansion felt preserved rather than simply neglected. Furniture sat under white sheets like sleeping giants. Paintings hung on the walls in careful arrangement, though their subjects were hidden behind decades of grime. Everything suggested a house that had been closed up purposefully, not abandoned in haste. Caleb moved deeper into the hall, his footsteps hollow on the wooden floors. To his right, French doors led to what might have been a parlor. To his left, a wide archway opened onto a library, its shelves stretching from floor to ceiling. Straight ahead, the hall continued toward what looked like a kitchen, with glimpses of a more casual living space beyond. "Dad, look at this," Maya called from the library doorway. She'd pulled aside a dust cover to reveal an ornate desk positioned beneath a tall window. "There's something weird about this wall." Caleb joined her, examining the space she was indicating. The library's built-in shelves covered 3 walls completely, but the 4th wall, the one behind the desk, showed an obvious interruption in the pattern. A rectangular space, roughly 3 feet wide and 4 feet tall, where the shelving had been removed or never installed. "There used to be something here," he said, running his hand over the faded wallpaper that marked the outline. "Something heavy, from the look of these scuff marks on the floor." Maya knelt down, examining the wooden floor more closely. "These aren't just scuff marks, Dad, look." She traced deep grooves in the hardwood with her finger. Something was dragged out of here, something with metal corners or feet. A safe, Caleb realized. There had been a safe here, and someone, presumably Samuel, had removed it. But when? And why? They continued their exploration, moving through the mansion's rooms like archaeologists uncovering a lost civilization. The kitchen still held vintage appliances from the 1950s, though they looked barely used. The living room contained furniture that spoke of comfortable evenings by the fireplace, though the grate was cold and swept clean. Everywhere they looked, they found the same peculiar mix of preservation and purposeful concealment. It was Maya who noticed the sealed doors. "Dad, come look at this," she called from the 2nd-floor landing. "This doesn't make sense." She was standing before a door that had been nailed shut, heavy boards crisscrossed over its frame and secured with industrial-grade nails, but this wasn't the casual boarding up of an unused room. The work was too precise, too intentional. "There are 3 more like this," Maya reported, having explored the entire 2nd floor while Caleb examined the bedrooms that remained accessible. "All sealed the same way, and look at this." She led him to the end of the hallway, where a narrow staircase led upward. A heavy chain had been wrapped around the newel post and secured with a padlock, blocking access to what could only be the attic. "Why would someone chain off the attic but leave the rest of the house open?" she asked. It was a good question. The accessible rooms showed normal signs of aging and disuse, but nothing that suggested danger or structural problems. The sealed areas seemed to be hidden rather than protected. Caleb examined the chain more closely. Unlike the nails on the doors, which looked old and rusted, this padlock was newer, maybe 5 years old, he estimated. Samuel had been securing areas of his own house right up until the end. A sudden gust of wind rattled the windows, and somewhere in the walls, something responded with a low whistle. Both Caleb and Maya froze, listening. "Just the wind," Caleb said, though the sound had seemed to come from inside the house rather than outside. "Maybe," Maya replied, but she didn't sound convinced. They made their way back downstairs, both of them feeling the weight of the mansion's secrets. Whatever Samuel had been protecting, he'd been thorough about it. But he'd also left the house to Caleb, which suggested he'd wanted these mysteries to be discovered eventually. As they reached the main floor, Maya wandered back toward the entry hall while Caleb took a final look at the library. The missing safe bothered him. If Samuel had removed it, where had he taken it? And what had been inside that was worth such careful concealment? "Dad!" Maya's voice carried a note of excitement that brought him running. He found her in the entry hall, standing beside an old steamer trunk that had been positioned beneath the staircase. "Look at the initials." Brass letters were mounted on the trunk's lid, SHT. Samuel Henry Turner, Caleb read aloud, his father's full name. "It's not locked," Maya said, her hand already on the latch. Inside, they found the carefully preserved artifacts of a life lived quietly, but purposefully. There were photographs, dozens of them, showing the mansion in various states of renovation and care. Samuel as a young man, working on the lighthouse tower. Samuel in middle age, standing proudly beside newly installed storm windows. Samuel in his later years, consulting with men in business suits who gestured toward documents spread across the very desk they'd found in the library. But it was the nautical charts that caught Caleb's attention. Hand-drawn maps showing the coastal waters around the mansion, with careful notations in Samuel's precise handwriting. Depth soundings, current patterns, seasonal weather observations. The kind of detailed knowledge that came from decades of careful study. "He was tracking something," Caleb murmured, spreading the charts on the trunk's lid. "Look at these annotations. Storm season approach vectors, safe harbor protocols, emergency beacon positions." Maya pulled out a leather-bound journal from the bottom of the trunk. Its pages were filled with Samuel's handwriting, dense paragraphs alternating with more nautical sketches and measurements. "The responsibility passes with the property," she read aloud from a passage near the front. "Each generation must understand what they guard. The sea remembers, even when the land forgets." "Guard?" Caleb took the journal from her, scanning the cryptic entries. "Guard what?" But before Maya could respond, they heard the distinctive sound of car doors slamming outside. Through the grimy windows, they could see Iris Moreno had returned, and this time she wasn't alone. A man in an expensive coat was walking beside her toward the front door, his gait confident and proprietary. "That must be Derek Lang," Maya whispered. Caleb quickly closed the trunk and straightened up, though he kept the journal in his hand. Whatever secrets Samuel had been protecting, he had the feeling they were about to become a lot more complicated. The knock on the door was firm and professional, the sound of people who were used to being invited in. That evening, after Derek Lang's polite but persistent visit, during which he'd walked through the mansion like a man already mentally demolishing it, Caleb sat alone in the kitchen, staring at the sealed envelope the attorney had given him alongside the property deed. Maya had gone to bed in one of the upstairs rooms, too excited by the day's discoveries to notice the musty smell or creaking floors that would have sent most teenagers running. The envelope was cream-colored, expensive paper that had yellowed slightly with age. His name was written across the front in Samuel's careful script. "For Caleb Turner, when the house calls him home." He'd been carrying it in his jacket pocket all day, aware of its weight but reluctant to open it. There was something final about reading his father's last words, something that would close the door on any possibility of reconciliation or understanding that might still exist between them. But Lang's visit had changed things. The developer had been charming and professional, expressing sympathy for their loss while simultaneously making it clear that he viewed the mansion as an obstacle to progress. He'd spoken of luxury condominiums, private beaches, helicopter landing pads, a vision of the future that would erase every trace of whatever Samuel had been trying to preserve. "Your father was a fascinating man," Lang had said, his eyes moving constantly around the room, cataloging and calculating. "Very protective of this old place. Almost territorial, you might say." The way he'd said it suggested Samuel's protectiveness had been a problem Lang had encountered before. Now, with the house settling into nighttime quiet around him, Caleb finally broke the envelope's seal. The letter was written on the same cream paper, Samuel's handwriting flowing across multiple pages with the careful precision of a man who knew these might be his last words to his son. My dear Caleb, if you are reading this, then I am gone, and you are standing in the house where your great-grandfather built something remarkable. I know you think I was a stubborn old fool, obsessed with a crumbling monument to the past. I know our relationship suffered because I could never explain what I was really protecting, without sounding like a man losing his grip on reality. But you are here now, which means the house has called you home, just as it called me home 40 years ago when my own father passed and left me with the same choice I am leaving you. Hidden within these walls is a trust that has protected our family and this town for more than a century, $80 million, Caleb. Not a fortune by today's standards, perhaps, but enough to secure Maya's future and honor the commitment our family made long ago. Caleb's hands trembled slightly as he read the number again. $80 million. It was impossible. If Samuel had access to that kind of money, why had he lived so simply? Why had he let Caleb struggle after Rebecca's death? The trust is not a simple inheritance. It comes with conditions that must be met within 1 year of my death. Think of them as restoration tasks, not just of the house, but of its purpose. Complete them, and the money is yours to steward as you see fit. Fail, and it returns to the foundation that created it, lost to our family forever. The tasks are these. First, unshutter the eyes that watch the sea. The lighthouse has been dark too long. Second, restore the heart that remembers. The great hall knows its purpose. Third, unlock the keeper's words. Truth sleeps behind carved wood and painted glass. Fourth, light the beacon that calls them home as it was in the beginning, so it must be again. I know these words sound like the ravings of an old man, but each task will lead you deeper into the house's history and closer to understanding why our family has been its guardians. Trust Maya's instincts. She sees things you have forgotten how to see. Trust Oliver Chen at the town archive. He knows more than he admits. And beware Derek Lang. He represents interests that would destroy everything we have protected. The sea strangers, as your great-grandfather called them, will offer you money to abandon your post. They will make it seem logical, practical, inevitable. But some things matter more than immediate profit. Some promises outlast the people who made them. I was not the father you needed, Caleb. I was too focused on being the guardian this house required. I pray you can be both. With love and hope, Samuel Turner. P.S. The trunk contains maps, but they are incomplete. The missing pieces wait in the keeper's room. Begin with the lighthouse. Maya will show you the way. Caleb read the letter twice, then set it on the kitchen table and stared at it as if it might change if he looked away and back again. $80 million. Cryptic restoration tasks. Warnings about sea strangers and promises that outlasted generations. It sounded exactly like the kind of romantic nonsense his father had always favored over practical reality. But then he thought about the nautical charts in the trunk, the precision of Samuel's notations, the professional care with which certain rooms had been sealed. And he thought about Lang's interest in the property, the speed with which Iris had appeared with an offer, the sense that forces were already moving to claim something they considered inevitable. "Dad?" Maya's voice came from the doorway, where she stood in borrowed pajamas that were too big for her. "I heard you moving around down here. Is everything okay?" "Come sit down," he said. "I want to show you something." She padded across the cold kitchen floor and settled beside him at the table. In the lamplight, she looked younger than her 15 years, but her eyes held the same curious intelligence that had driven her to notice the mansion's hidden details. "This is from your grandfather," Caleb said, handing her the letter. Maya read in silence, her eyes growing wider with each paragraph. When she finished, she looked up at her father with an expression he couldn't quite read. "Do you believe it?" she asked. It was the question he'd been dreading, because the practical answer was no. Elderly men often developed elaborate fantasies about their possessions, seeing significance where none existed. The responsible thing would be to take Lang's offer, secure their future, and let someone else worry about preserving the past. But sitting in his father's kitchen, surrounded by the careful preservation of decades, Caleb found himself remembering the boy who'd once loved visiting this house, who'd spent hours exploring its rooms and listening to Samuel's stories about ships and storms, and the families who'd made their living from the sea. "I think," he said carefully, "that your grandfather was a lot of things, but he wasn't a liar. And I think he wouldn't have left us this place if he didn't believe we could handle whatever comes with it." Maya smiled, the first truly happy expression he'd seen from her since Rebecca's death. "So we try?" she asked. "We do the restoration tasks?" "We try," Caleb agreed. "But Maya, if this turns out to be—" "It won't," she interrupted with the confidence of someone too young to understand how often hope disappointed. "Look at this place, Dad. Really look at it. Does this feel like the house of a man who was losing his mind?" She was right. For all its age and neglect, the mansion felt purposeful, waiting, as if it had been holding its breath for decades, anticipating this moment when the right people would finally understand what it was trying to tell them. "Okay," Caleb said. "Tomorrow we start with the lighthouse. Unshutter the eyes that watch the sea." Outside, the wind picked up again, and this time the whistle that echoed through the walls sounded almost like approval. The morning light revealed the lighthouse tower in all its weathered glory. Attached to the mansion's north side, it rose 40 feet above the cliff, its white paint peeling like old skin. Maya stood at its base, craning her neck to examine the windows that ringed the top, windows that had been boarded over with the same industrial precision they'd seen throughout the house. "Unshutter the eyes that watch the sea," Caleb read from Samuel's letter again. I guess that's pretty literal. They'd spent the early hours gathering tools from the mansion's surprisingly well-stocked garage. Samuel had left behind a collection of equipment that suggested years of careful maintenance: crowbars, hammers, an extension ladder that looked recently purchased. Everything they needed to begin dismantling whatever barriers he'd erected. "Dad, look at this," Maya called from the lighthouse's entrance. She'd been examining the heavy door while Caleb wrestled with the ladder. "The lock is different from all the others." She was right. While the rest of the mansion's sealed areas had been secured with chains and boards, the lighthouse door bore an ornate brass lock that looked far older than anything else they'd encountered. Its keyhole was unusual, larger than modern keys, with decorative scrollwork that matched the nautical motifs carved throughout the house. "Probably original to the building," Caleb said, though something about the lock's condition bothered him. For all its apparent age, the brass gleamed as if it had been recently cleaned and maintained. Maya pulled out her phone and began photographing the lock from multiple angles. She'd inherited Rebecca's habit of documenting everything, a trait that had served her well in school projects and was proving invaluable in their current investigation. "I want to compare this to the symbols in Grandpa's letter," she explained, "and maybe we can find out more about when this lighthouse was actually built. The town archive should have records." While Maya documented the door, Caleb set up the ladder and began the careful work of removing the boards from the lighthouse windows. Each piece of wood had been marked with small notations in Samuel's handwriting, numbers and letters that suggested a specific order for reassembly if needed. The first board came away easily, revealing glass that was surprisingly clean beneath. As more boards fell away, light began to flood into the lighthouse's interior, illuminating what had been hidden for years. "Maya, you need to see this," Caleb called down. She climbed the ladder quickly, joining him at one of the now unboarded windows. Below them, the lighthouse's circular interior was revealed in stunning detail. The walls were lined with built-in shelves that held nautical instruments, brass sextants, ship chronometers, barometers, and compasses. Charts covered a central table, weighted down with glass paperweights. But most striking was the spiral staircase that curved upward to the lamp room, its iron railings polished to a gleam that suggested recent care. "It's like a ship's navigation room," Maya breathed, "but on land." "More than that," Caleb said, studying the arrangement below. "Look at how everything's positioned. This wasn't just for show. Someone was using this equipment regularly." They made their way down and approached the lighthouse door again. This time, Caleb examined the lock more carefully, running his fingers over its intricate surface. Hidden among the decorative scrollwork, he found what he was looking for: a small symbol pressed into the brass. A compass rose, identical to one of the carvings they'd noticed on the mansion's exterior. "The symbol matches," Maya said, comparing her photos. "But we still don't have a key." "Maybe we don't need one yet," Caleb replied. He was thinking about Samuel's letter. about the methodical way his father had approached everything. The first task was to unshutter the eyes. Maybe that's all we need to do right now. They spent the rest of the morning removing boards from all the lighthouse windows. With each barrier that fell away, the tower seemed to come alive. Light streamed through the glass, creating patterns on the polished instruments inside. And from their vantage point on the ladder, they could see for miles along the coast, fishing boats moving between the offshore rocks, waves breaking against hidden reefs, the mouth of the harbor where the town's remaining fishing fleet made their home. "I can see why someone would build a lighthouse here," Maya said during a break. "The view is incredible." "And dangerous," Caleb added, noting the rocky outcroppings that jutted from the surf below. Ships would need guidance to navigate safely. By afternoon, the lighthouse windows were clear, and the tower looked like it had awakened from a long sleep. But the door remained locked, and they were no closer to understanding what lay inside. It was Maya who made the next discovery. While Caleb was putting away the tools, she'd been exploring the area around the lighthouse's base. The tower was built into a natural outcropping of rock. Its foundation stones fitted so precisely that they seemed to grow from the cliff itself. "Dad, there's something carved here," she called from the far side of the foundation, hidden behind some ivy. Caleb joined her, pulling away the overgrown vines to reveal more symbols carved directly into the stone. Not decorative motifs this time, but what looked like a message. The carving was weathered but still legible. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. E. Whitford, keeper, 1923 to 1957, S. Turner, keeper, 1957 to 1989, S. H. Turner, keeper, 1989 to 2024. Below the names, a final line. The watch continues. "Keepers," Maya said softly. "Grandpa wasn't just living here. He was keeping something." Caleb stared at the dates, doing the math. Samuel Henry Turner, his father, had been the lighthouse keeper for 35 years, and before him their family had been responsible for whatever this lighthouse protected for nearly a century. "E. Whitford," he said, recognizing the name. "That must be Eleanor Whitford's family, the neighbor." "She would remember," Maya said with growing excitement. "If her family were keepers before ours, she'd know what this is all about." As if summoned by their conversation, they heard a voice calling from the mansion's front yard. An elderly woman was making her way up the overgrown path, moving slowly but with determination. "Eleanor Whitford," Caleb murmured. They hurried around the lighthouse to meet her. She was a small woman in her 80s with silver hair pulled back in a practical bun and eyes that held the sharp intelligence of someone who'd seen decades of secrets come and go. "I saw the light coming through the lighthouse windows," she said without preamble. "Thought it was time we had a talk." Maya stepped forward eagerly. "Mrs. Whitford, we found your father's name carved in the foundation. He was a keeper?" Eleanor smiled, the first warm expression they'd seen from any of the locals. "Edward Whitford. Keeper for 34 years until Samuel's father took over. And before that, my grandfather kept the light." She looked up at the now unboarded windows with satisfaction. About time someone brought her back to life. "Brought what back to life?" Caleb asked. Eleanor's eyes shifted to him, measuring. "The Sentinel, of course, though I suppose you wouldn't know that name. Samuel was always careful about what he shared, even with family." "Mrs. Whitford," Maya said, "we found a letter from our grandfather. He mentioned restoration tasks and something about a trust. Do you know what he was talking about?" The elderly woman was quiet for a long moment, studying both of them. Then she reached into her purse and pulled out a small brass key. "Samuel gave me this 3 years ago," she said. "Told me to hold on to it until the right Turner came home." She looked directly at Caleb. "I reckon that's you." The key was warm from her touch, its metal polished smooth by decades of handling. And carved into its head was the same compass rose symbol they'd been finding throughout the property. "What does it open?" Caleb asked. "The keeper's room," Eleanor replied, "though I suspect you'll find more questions than answers, at least at first. That's the way of this place. It gives up its secrets slowly, to people who prove they're worthy of them." She turned to go, then paused. "One more thing. Derek Lang came by my house yesterday, asking questions about the lighthouse. Wanted to know if I remembered when it stopped working. I told him I didn't remember much about anything. Her smile was sharp. "But I remember everything. And I remember that some lights are meant to keep shining, no matter who wants to put them out." As Eleanor made her way back down the path, Caleb and Maya stared at the key in his hand. It felt heavier than its size suggested, weighted with responsibility and expectation. "The keeper's room," Maya said. "That has to be inside the lighthouse." Caleb nodded, looking up at the tower that now seemed to be watching them with its newly uncovered eyes. Whatever they found behind that brass lock, he had the feeling there would be no turning back. The Millhaven Town Archive occupied the basement of the old library, a cramped space that smelled of old paper and the persistent dampness that plagued all coastal buildings. Maya had insisted they research the lighthouse's history before using Eleanor's key, and Caleb had to admit her instincts were sound. Samuel's letter had specifically mentioned trusting Oliver Chen, and if the archivist knew more than he admitted, they needed that knowledge before venturing deeper into their family secrets. Oliver Chen looked to be in his early 40s, with the pale complexion of someone who spent most of his time indoors and the careful movements of a person accustomed to handling fragile things. He'd returned to Millhaven 2 years earlier after working at the Oregon State Museum, a fact that Maya had discovered through 15 minutes of determined internet research. "The Sentinel Lighthouse," Oliver said when they showed him the photographs Maya had taken of the carved symbols. His reaction was immediate and intense. A sharp intake of breath, followed by a long pause as he studied the images on Maya's phone. "I was wondering when someone would come asking about that." "You know about it?" Caleb asked. "I know about a lot of things that don't make it into the official town records," Oliver replied carefully. "The question is, why are you asking? Most people around here prefer to let sleeping lighthouses lie." Maya leaned forward eagerly. "We're Turners. Samuel Turner was our grandfather. He left us the mansion and some instructions about restoration." Oliver's demeanor shifted perceptibly. Where he'd been guarded before, now he seemed almost relieved. "Samuel Turner. I met him a few times before he passed. Interesting man. Very knowledgeable about maritime history." He paused. "Very protective of certain information." "What kind of information?" Caleb asked. Instead of answering directly, Oliver stood and walked to a filing cabinet that looked like it predated the digital age. He withdrew a thick folder marked Maritime Trust, Historical Context, and set it on the table between them. "What I'm about to show you isn't exactly public record," he said, "but it's not secret either. It's just overlooked. People see what they want to see, especially when it comes to local history." The folder contained photocopies of documents dating back to the 1890s, written in the formal language of legal agreements in maritime commerce. But as Caleb read, a story began to emerge that was far more complex than simple shipping records. In 1892, a consortium of wealthy shipowners and merchants had established something called the Coastal Heritage Maritime Trust. Ostensibly designed to improve navigation safety along the Oregon coast, the trust had funded the construction of several lighthouse stations, including the one attached to the Turner Mansion. But the trust's real purpose went deeper than navigation. According to the documents Oliver showed them, it had been created to preserve the maritime traditions and economic independence of coastal communities. In the face of industrial consolidation and outside exploitation, it was basically an early form of community preservation, Oliver explained. The trust provided funding for local fishing operations, maintained safe harbor facilities, and protected traditional fishing grounds from being bought up by larger companies. "And this trust still exists?" Maya asked. "Theoretically, yes, though it's been dormant for decades. The last active trustee was," Oliver checked his notes, "Samuel H. Turner, who inherited the position from his father in 1989. Caleb felt pieces of a puzzle clicking into place. "So my father wasn't just maintaining the lighthouse, he was the trustee of an organization designed to protect the town's maritime heritage." "That's the simplified version," Oliver agreed. "But there's more. The trust was funded by a substantial endowment, shipping profits from the height of the Pacific lumber trade. According to these records, that endowment was worth approximately $12 million in 1950. $12 million in 1950, Maya said, doing quick calculations on her phone. "That would be about $80 million today," Oliver finished. "Assuming careful investment and compound growth." The number from Samuel's letter. Caleb and Maya exchanged glances, both thinking the same thing. "The trust exists," Caleb said, "and my father was its guardian." "Guardian, yes, but not owner." Oliver pulled out another document, this one more recent. "The trust has very specific conditions for its activation. It requires a unanimous vote from 3 trustees, representatives of the founding families. And it can only be used for purposes that align with the original maritime heritage mission." 3 trustees? Maya asked. "Who are the others?" "One position has been held by the Whitford family since the trust's founding. Eleanor Whitford is the current trustee, though she's never exercised any authority." "The 3rd position," Oliver hesitated. "The 3rd position has been vacant since 1987, when the Chen family line ended." "Chen," Caleb said. "Are you related to the original trustees?" Oliver nodded reluctantly. "My great-grandfather was one of the founding members. When I moved back to Millhaven, Samuel sought me out. He'd been researching my family history, trying to determine if I could legitimately claim the trustee position." "And can you?" "Legally, yes. Practically," Oliver gestured around the cramped archive. "I'm a historian, not a maritime businessman. I understand the trust's purpose, but I'm not sure I'm qualified to guide its future." Maya had been studying the documents while the adults talked. Now she looked up with the expression that meant she'd spotted something important. "According to this," she said, pointing to a passage in the original trust agreement, "the trustees don't just manage the money. They're responsible for maintaining, quote, the maritime stations and their associated guidance systems." "The lighthouse," Caleb said. "All the lighthouses," Oliver corrected. "The trust funded 7 lighthouse stations along this stretch of coast. 6 have been decommissioned or destroyed. The Sentinel is the last one still standing." "And if it's not maintained?" Maya asked. Oliver pulled out a final document, a thick legal brief that looked much more recent than the historical papers. "Then the trust dissolves and its assets revert to the state of Oregon for general maritime safety improvements." Caleb understood now why Samuel had been so protective, so secretive. The lighthouse wasn't just family property. It was the key to $80 million in community resources. And there were people who would prefer to see that money flow through state channels rather than local control. "Derek Lang," he said. "He's not just a developer. He represents interests that want the trust dissolved." "I can't prove that," Oliver said carefully. "But I can tell you that Lang has been very interested in maritime property records. And he's asked some very specific questions about the legal status of historical lighthouse stations." Maya was photographing pages from the trust documents, her phone's camera clicking steadily. "So the restoration tasks in Grandpa's letter, they're not just about fixing up the house. They're about proving the lighthouse is still active, still serving its purpose." "That would be my interpretation," Oliver agreed. "The trust requires its maritime stations to be, quote, functional and serving the navigation needs of the community. If the Sentinel can't meet that standard, then the trust dissolves and Lang gets his luxury resort," Caleb finished. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of responsibility settling over them. This wasn't just about inheriting money. It was about preserving a century-old commitment to protecting their community's independence. "There's something else," Oliver said finally. "Something Samuel asked me to research in the months before he died." He pulled out a map of the coast, marked with red X's at various points offshore. He was convinced the trust's original purpose went beyond simple navigation aid. "These marks show the locations of historical shipwrecks." "Shipwrecks?" Maya asked. "More specifically, ships that were saved by lighthouse warnings." Samuel believed the trust's founders weren't just protecting commerce, they were protecting lives, and he thought that mission was more important now than ever. Oliver pointed to a section of the map near the Turner Mansion. "Climate change has altered weather patterns along the coast. Storms are stronger, more unpredictable. The shipping lanes that were safe 50 years ago are dangerous now. But modern navigation systems don't account for local conditions the way the old lighthouses did." "You're saying the lighthouse could actually save lives?" Caleb asked. "I'm saying Samuel believed it could, and he spent the last decade of his life documenting shipping incidents that might have been prevented by active lighthouse guidance." Oliver closed the folder. "Whether you believe that or not is up to you. But if you're going to activate the trust, you'll need to prove the lighthouse can serve its intended purpose." As they prepared to leave, Oliver handed Caleb a business card. "I'd like to help, if you'll have me. As the 3rd trustee, I have a responsibility to see this through properly. And as a historian," he smiled, I'd hate to see $80 million in community resources disappear because no one bothered to maintain a lighthouse. Walking back to the mansion, Maya was uncharacteristically quiet. Finally, she spoke. "Dad, this is bigger than we thought." "Much bigger," Caleb agreed. "Are we still going to try?" Caleb looked up at the lighthouse tower, its windows now gleaming in the afternoon sun. Eleanor Whitford's key felt warm in his pocket, and for the first time since reading Samuel's letter, he felt the weight of genuine possibility rather than desperate hope. "We're going to try," he said, "but first we're going to find out what's in the keeper's room." Eleanor Whitford's house sat just beyond the mansion's eastern boundary, a modest Cape Cod that looked like it had grown from the rocky soil itself. Unlike the Turner property with its air of faded grandeur, Eleanor's home was immaculately maintained. Fresh paint, carefully tended garden, windows that sparkled in the afternoon light. It was the house of someone who understood that small things, properly cared for, could outlast grand gestures. She answered the door before they knocked, as if she'd been watching for them. "I was wondering how long it would take you to come calling," she said with a smile that reminded Caleb of his childhood teachers, warm but sharp-eyed. "Come in, come in. I've got tea on." Her living room was a carefully curated museum of coastal life. Maritime antiques filled the space without cluttering it. Ship wheels, brass lanterns, framed photographs of fishing boats from decades past. But it was the photographs on the mantelpiece that caught Maya's attention. "Is that the lighthouse?" she asked, pointing to a black and white image that showed the tower with its light blazing. 1956, Eleanor confirmed, settling into a chair that had clearly been hers for decades. "Last time it was lit for a rescue. Fishing boat got caught in a squall. Couldn't find the harbor entrance in the fog. My father guided them in." She paused, her eyes distant. "Saved 4 lives that night." Caleb accepted a cup of tea that tasted like salt air and memories. "Mrs. Whitford, we need to understand what my father was really protecting. Oliver Chen showed us documents about the Maritime Trust, but documents don't tell you what it felt like," Eleanor interrupted gently. "They don't tell you about winter nights when the fog rolled in thick as cotton, and boats were out there somewhere, listening for the foghorn that would guide them home." She stood and moved to a window that looked directly across to the lighthouse tower. "Your great-grandfather, Thomas Turner, he understood that responsibility, took it seriously, never missed a night of lighting the beacon during storm season, not in 40 years. "And my grandfather?" Caleb asked. "Samuel Sr. was different, more focused on the business side of things, the trust, the community protection, but he kept the light burning when it mattered." Eleanor's expression grew more complex. "Your father, though, Samuel Henry, was something else entirely." She returned to her chair, cradling her teacup. "When young Samuel took over in '89, most folks thought the lighthouse days were finished. GPS was becoming common. Weather radar was improving. Who needed an old lighthouse? But Grandpa kept it going," Maya said. "Oh, he did more than that." Eleanor's eyes lit up with something between admiration and concern. "Samuel Henry studied those waters like they were scripture. Tracked every storm, every shipping incident, every change in the currents. He turned that lighthouse into a proper maritime research station." She stood again and retrieved a photo album from a bookshelf. The pages showed the lighthouse through different decades, but also documented its evolution. What had once been a simple beacon had gradually accumulated sophisticated equipment. Weather monitoring instruments, radio antennae, electronic navigation aids. "Samuel convinced the Coast Guard to let him maintain an official weather station," Eleanor explained. "Then he got connected with the university's oceanography department. By the 2000s, that lighthouse was providing navigation data for the entire Central Oregon coast." "So it wasn't just sentimental preservation," Caleb said, beginning to understand. "Hardly. Your father proved that the old lighthouse could serve modern purposes, saved the Coast Guard thousands in maintenance costs, provided better local weather data than their automated stations." Eleanor turned a page to show Samuel working with what looked like sophisticated computer equipment. He was always upgrading, always improving. Made that old tower more effective than lighthouses twice its size. Maya leaned forward eagerly. "But why all the secrecy? Why lock everything up and leave cryptic instructions instead of just explaining?" Eleanor's expression grew serious. Because about 5 years ago, certain interests started pressuring the Coast Guard to decommission the station. Said it was redundant, expensive to maintain. There was talk of selling the equipment, turning the lighthouse into a, quote, historical display. Derek Lang, Caleb said, among others. But Samuel was stubborn. He knew that if the lighthouse lost its official function, the Maritime Trust would lose its legal basis. So he started, let's call it strategic documentation. She produced a key from her pocket, not brass like the one she'd given them yesterday, but modern steel. Samuel asked me to hold on to this as well. Said if anything happened to him, I should make sure the right people could access his research. What does it open? Maya asked. Storage unit in town. Samuel rented it 3 years ago, started moving his most important files there. Said he didn't trust leaving everything in the house. Eleanor's smile was grim. Smart man. Lang's people have been very interested in what might be hidden in that mansion. Caleb felt a chill that had nothing to do with the coastal air. They'd been inside? Not inside, exactly, but there have been surveyors, inspectors, people with clipboards asking questions about structural integrity and safety compliance. All very official, all very concerned about whether an old lighthouse might be dangerous. She handed Maya the storage unit key. Unit 47 at Coastal Storage on Harbor Road. Samuel's files are there. Weather data, shipping reports, correspondence with the Coast Guard, and university researchers. Everything you'll need to prove the lighthouse is still serving its purpose. And if we can prove that? Caleb asked. Then the Maritime Trust remains valid, and you have the legal standing to activate it. Eleanor's voice carried the satisfaction of someone who'd spent years waiting for this moment. $80 million, managed by 3 trustees who understand the coast's real needs. Maya was studying one of the photographs more closely. It showed Samuel standing beside a tall man in a Coast Guard uniform, both of them pointing toward the lighthouse. Mrs. Whitford, who is this? Commander James Morrison, Coast Guard Station Coos Bay. He worked with Samuel for 15 years, helped establish the weather monitoring program. Eleanor's smile turned mischievous. Retired last year, but I happen to know he's been very unhappy about the pressure to decommission the lighthouse station. Might be willing to provide some professional testimony about its ongoing value. You've been planning this, Caleb realized. Planning, hoping, preparing. Eleanor stood and walked to the window again, looking across at the lighthouse where afternoon light was beginning to catch the newly unboarded windows. This community has been shaped by the sea for more than a century. The trust was created to preserve that connection, to make sure outside interests couldn't come in and erase everything we've built. She turned back to them, her expression fierce despite her age. Your father understood that responsibility, even if he wasn't always good at explaining it. Now it's your turn to decide whether preserving the past is worth fighting for. As they prepared to leave, Eleanor walked them to the door. One more thing, she said, pressing a small wrapped package into Maya's hands. This belonged to my father, but Samuel always admired it. Thought it might be useful someday. Maya unwrapped a brass compass, its face darkened with age but still perfectly functional. Engraved on the back were the words, E. Whitford, Lighthouse Keeper, 1923-1957. The watch continues. Every keeper needs a compass, Eleanor said simply. Walking back to the mansion, Caleb felt the weight of generational responsibility settling on his shoulders. This wasn't just about money or property. It was about continuing a century-old commitment to protecting something valuable and irreplaceable. Dad, Maya said as they approached the lighthouse door, are you scared? Terrified, he admitted, but not of what we might find. I'm scared of what happens if we don't try. The brass key Eleanor had given them the day before felt warm in his hand. Whatever lay behind the lighthouse door, they were about to take the final step into Samuel's world and into their own future as keepers of the Sentinel. Ready? He asked. Maya nodded, her hand tight around Eleanor's compass. Ready! The key turned smoothly in the old lock, as if it had been waiting decades for exactly this moment. The brass key turned with surprising ease, as if the lock had been maintained despite years of disuse. The lighthouse door swung open on well-oiled hinges, releasing a breath of air that carried the scent of machine oil, salt, and something else. The distinctive smell of sophisticated electronics. Caleb stepped inside first, Maya close behind him. The circular room was larger than it had appeared from outside, its walls lined with built-in shelving that held an impressive array of nautical instruments. But these weren't museum pieces gathering dust. Everything gleamed with the care of equipment that had been regularly used and maintained. "Dad, look at this!" Maya breathed, moving toward a central workstation that dominated the room's center. The desk was a masterpiece of organization. Charts covered its surface, held flat by weighted corners, showing detailed bathymetric maps of the local coastline. But these weren't standard navigation charts. They were annotated with Samuel's precise handwriting, tracking everything from seasonal current changes to the migration patterns of commercial fishing fleets. Above the desk, mounted monitors displayed what looked like real-time weather data. Even now, without power to the lighthouse, the screens showed the ghostly after-images of their last displays: barometric pressure readings, wind speed indicators, wave height measurements. "This is incredible," Caleb murmured, examining a rack of radio equipment that looked both vintage and cutting-edge. He wasn't just playing lighthouse keeper. This is a fully functional maritime monitoring station. Maya had discovered a spiral staircase that curved upward along the lighthouse's interior wall. "Can we go up to the light room?" They climbed carefully, the iron steps ringing beneath their feet. The lighthouse's upper chamber took Caleb's breath away. The original Fresnel lens had been preserved and restored, its prismatic faces catching and fracturing the afternoon light into rainbow patterns that danced across the walls. But surrounding the historic beacon, Samuel had installed modern LED arrays and focusing systems that could have guided ships from miles offshore. "It's like he built a bridge between past and future," Maya said, running her fingers along the lens housing, keeping the old light but making it work for modern ships. From the lighthouse's windows they could see for miles along the coast. Fishing boats dotted the offshore waters, and in the distance a container ship followed the shipping lane that passed just outside the harbor. The strategic importance of the lighthouse's position was immediately obvious. Any vessel approaching the coast would benefit from its guidance. But it was what they found in the lighthouse's storage compartments that truly revealed Samuel's purpose. Hidden behind a panel in the workstation, Caleb discovered a waterproof case containing documents that made the scope of his father's work finally clear. "Coast Guard authorization," he read aloud from an official letterhead. "Maritime weather station license, renewed annually through 2024. Partnership agreement with Oregon State University Department of Oceanography." He looked up at Maya. "Your grandfather wasn't just maintaining this lighthouse. He was running an official government weather station." Maya was examining another document from the case. "Dad, listen to this." It's a letter from the Coast Guard commander Eleanor mentioned, this Morrison guy. "The Sentinel station has provided critical navigation data for more than 200 vessel assists over the past decade. Its local weather monitoring has prevented an estimated 15 to 20 potential maritime emergencies by providing early warning of hazardous conditions." "Prevented emergencies," Caleb repeated. "So this lighthouse is still saving lives." "Was saving lives," Maya corrected. "Look at the date on this authorization. It expired 3 months after Grandpa's death." The weight of that realization settled over them. Samuel had been maintaining official authorization for the lighthouse's operation, but with his death, that authorization had lapsed. The Maritime Trust's legal foundation depended on the lighthouse serving an active navigation purpose, but technically, it was no longer an official station. "That's why Lang is pushing so hard for quick development," Caleb said. "If we can't re-establish the lighthouse's official status, the trust dissolves by default." Maya was studying the equipment with new understanding. "But if all this stuff is here and it was working until recently, couldn't we get the authorization renewed?" "Way, maybe, but we'd need to prove we can operate it properly." Caleb looked around the sophisticated monitoring station. "This isn't just turning on a light. This is maintaining professional-grade weather and navigation equipment." A sound from below made them both freeze, the lighthouse door closing with a definitive click. Footsteps echoed on the iron stairs, measured and confident. "Mr. Turner?" Derek Lang's voice carried up from the main chamber. "I hope you don't mind the intrusion." The door was open. Caleb and Maya exchanged glances. They hadn't left the door open, which meant Lang had somehow obtained access, or simply ignored the fact that it was locked. "We'll be right down," Caleb called, quickly securing the documents back in their waterproof case. They found Lang examining the radio equipment with the practiced eye of someone who understood what he was looking at. He was dressed casually, expensive jeans and a fleece jacket that probably cost more than Caleb made in a month, but his presence in the lighthouse felt like an invasion. "Impressive setup," Lang said without preamble. "Your father was quite the electronics enthusiast." "He was a Coast Guard licensed weather station operator," Maya said pointedly. Lang's smile was polished and dismissive. "Was being the operative term. I understand the station's authorization lapsed after his death." He gestured around the room. "All this equipment, just sitting here unused. Seems like a waste of resources." "We're working on renewing the authorization," Caleb said. "Are you?" Lang's tone suggested mild interest, but his eyes were calculating. "Do you have experience operating maritime weather stations?" "Coast Guard certification." "University partnerships." He paused. "Because I understand those things are required for official designation." Caleb felt the trap closing. Lang had done his homework, knew exactly what hurdles they'd face in trying to reactivate the lighthouse. "Mr. Lang," Maya said, "why are you so interested in what we do with our property?" "Because, Miss Turner, your property sits on one of the most valuable pieces of undeveloped coastline in Oregon. The lighthouse is charming, historically significant, but ultimately obsolete." He moved toward the windows, gazing out at the ocean view. "I'm developing a luxury resort that would bring jobs and tourist revenue to Millhaven. This lighthouse could be the centerpiece, a beautiful historical display that guests could visit." "A display," Caleb repeated. "Exactly. All the charm, none of the operational complications. And my offer stands $2 million, which is far more than you'd ever see from trying to reactivate a maritime trust that most people have forgotten exists." Lang moved toward the door, then paused. "Oh, and Mr. Turner? I should mention that I've filed a formal inquiry with the Coast Guard about the safety of unlicensed individuals operating radio equipment on maritime frequencies. Apparently, there are substantial fines for unauthorized use of emergency communication systems." The threat was politely delivered but unmistakable. Lang wasn't just offering to buy them out. He was preparing to make their position legally untenable. After he left, Caleb and Maya sat in silence among Samuel's carefully maintained equipment. The lighthouse felt different now, less like a sanctuary and more like a fortress under siege. "He's trying to scare us," Maya said finally. "He's succeeding," Caleb admitted. "Maya, what if we're in over our heads? What if Samuel's dream was bigger than what we can actually accomplish?" Maya picked up Eleanor's compass from where she'd set it on the workstation, its brass surface catching the light from the Fresnel lens above them. "Dad, remember what Mrs. Whitford said about her father? He never missed a night of lighting the beacon during storm season, not in 40 years. That was different. The world was simpler then." "Was it?" Maya challenged. "Or did people just understand that some things are worth protecting, even when they're difficult?" She stood and moved to the windows, looking out at the ocean where fishing boats were beginning to head back toward harbor as evening approached. "Grandpa spent 35 years keeping this lighthouse running. He updated it, improved it, proved it could serve modern purposes. Are we really going to let some developer turn it into a tourist attraction because renewing a Coast Guard license seems too hard?" Caleb joined her at the window, watching the boats navigate between the offshore rocks. From this vantage point, he could see how the lighthouse's beam would guide them safely home, just as it had for more than a century. "You're right," he said quietly. "Samuel didn't leave us this place because it would be easy. He left it because he believed we could continue what he started." Maya smiled, the first genuinely happy expression he'd seen from her since Rebecca's death. "So we fight? We fight. But first, we need help." Caleb pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts until he found the number Eleanor had given them. "Commander Morrison is retired Coast Guard. If anyone knows how to navigate the bureaucracy of lighthouse authorization, it's him." As they prepared to lock up the lighthouse, Maya paused at the Fresnel lens. "Dad, what's the next restoration task from Grandpa's letter?" Caleb consulted the letter. "Restore the heart that remembers. The Great Hall knows its purpose." "The Great Hall," Maya repeated. "That's the main room in the mansion, right?" "Must be, though I'm not sure what we're supposed to restore there." Maya grinned, her investigative instincts clearly engaged. Only one way to find out. As they descended the lighthouse stairs, Caleb felt a shift in his understanding of their situation. They weren't just inheriting property or even money. They were being invited to join a tradition of guardianship that stretched back generations. The weight of that responsibility was daunting, but for the first time since reading Samuel's letter, it also felt possible. Outside, the first stars were appearing in the clear sky, and the lighthouse windows reflected their light like a promise of illumination to come. Commander James Morrison turned out to be a compact man in his 60s, with the weathered hands of someone who'd spent decades working with boats and the sharp eyes of someone accustomed to reading dangerous weather. He arrived at the mansion the following morning, driving a pickup truck that had clearly seen better days but was meticulously maintained, much like the man himself. Samuel Turner was one of the finest amateur meteorologists I ever worked with, he said without preamble as he stood in the lighthouse examining the equipment. Coast Guard lost a valuable resource when he passed. Maya had spent the previous evening researching Coast Guard regulations on maritime weather stations, and she bombarded Morrison with questions while he methodically tested each piece of Samuel's equipment. The authorization process is straightforward but not simple, Morrison explained as he calibrated a barometric pressure sensor. You need demonstrated competency in maritime, weather observation, proper equipment certification, and a partnership agreement with either the Coast Guard or an accredited oceanographic institution. How long does that typically take? Caleb asked. For someone starting from scratch, 6 to 8 months, minimum. For someone inheriting an established station with proper documentation. Morrison paused, consulting a thick manual he'd brought with him. Could be as little as 6 weeks if everything is in order. Is everything in order? Maya asked hopefully. Morrison's expression was carefully neutral. Samuel's equipment is top-notch, properly calibrated and well-maintained. His weather logs are meticulous and would serve as excellent documentation of the station's historical performance. He paused. The challenge is proving continuity of operation and demonstrating that the new operators can maintain professional standards. Caleb understood the subtext. You're saying we need to prove we know what we're doing. I'm saying the Coast Guard needs assurance that the Sentinel station will continue to provide reliable data. Samuel had 35 years of experience and a degree in marine engineering. You're a history teacher and a high school student. The blunt assessment stung, but Morrison wasn't finished. However, he continued, the Coast Guard also values community partnerships and historical preservation. If you could demonstrate community support for the lighthouse's continued operation, and if you had experienced oversight for the initial certification period, you'd be willing to help? Maya asked. Morrison smiled for the first time since arriving. Samuel saved my nephew's fishing boat 3 years ago with an early storm warning. The boy was too proud to turn back when the weather started changing, but Samuel's radio call convinced him to seek shelter. That storm sank 2 boats that didn't get the warning. He looked around the lighthouse with obvious respect. I believe this station serves a vital purpose. If you're serious about continuing Samuel's work, I'll help you navigate the certification process. It was exactly the break they needed, and Caleb felt genuine hope for the first time in days. Then Morrison's radio crackled to life. Commander Morrison, this is Coast Guard Station Coos Bay. Please respond. Morrison frowned as he answered. This is Morrison. Go ahead. Sir, we've received a formal complaint about unauthorized radio transmissions from the Sentinel station. We need to verify that all equipment there is properly secured and not in use. Morrison's expression darkened. He keyed the radio again. Station Coos Bay, this is Morrison. I'm currently conducting an authorized inspection of the Sentinel equipment. All transmitters are powered down and secured. Copy that, Commander. We'll note your report. Be advised that we've had multiple complaints about the station's operational status. Any unauthorized use of maritime frequencies could result in substantial penalties. After signing off, Morrison turned to Caleb with a grim expression. Someone's been making trouble for you. Multiple complaints suggest a coordinated effort to prevent reactivation. Derek Lang, Maya said immediately. Possibly, or someone working with him. Morrison began a more thorough examination of the radio equipment. The good news is that everything here is properly licensed and secured. The bad news is that someone is actively trying to create legal obstacles to your certification. They spent the rest of the morning going through Samuel's documentation, with Morrison helping them understand what would be required for reactivation. The process was complex but achievable, assuming they could overcome the bureaucratic resistance that someone was clearly orchestrating. It was just after noon when Derek Lang arrived, this time in a different vehicle, a Mercedes SUV that looked like it belonged in a luxury resort brochure rather than on a coastal road. He was accompanied by a woman in a business suit who carried herself with the confidence of someone accustomed to getting her way. "Mr. Turner," Lang said as he approached the lighthouse where they were working, "I'd like you to meet Victoria Chen, my partner in the Millhaven Resort Development Project." Caleb noticed Maya's sharp intake of breath. Chen. The same family name as Oliver, the town archivist. "Ms. Chen," Caleb said carefully. "Are you related to Oliver Chen?" Victoria Chen's smile was polished and professional. "Oliver is my brother, though we have very different perspectives on how to honor our family's legacy." Morrison stepped forward, his posture subtly defensive. "Ma'am, we're conducting official Coast Guard business here. If you need to speak with Mr. Turner, perhaps you could wait until we're finished." "Actually, Commander Morrison, our business relates directly to the lighthouse," Lang said smoothly. "Ms. Chen represents the Chen family interest in the Maritime Trust. As a descendant of the original trustees, she has legal standing to challenge any decisions about the trust's future." The implications hit Caleb immediately. If Victoria Chen opposed reactivation of the lighthouse, and if she could legally claim the Chen family trustee position, then the three-trustee requirement for trust activation would be impossible to meet. "I understand you've been exploring the possibility of reactivating the Maritime Trust," Victoria said, her tone reasonable but firm. "I appreciate the historical significance, but I'm afraid the practical realities make that impossible." "What practical realities?" Maya asked, her voice tight with anger. "The maritime industry has changed dramatically since the trust was founded," Victoria explained. "Modern navigation systems have made individual lighthouse stations obsolete. The community would be better served by selling the trust's assets and using the proceeds for broadly beneficial development projects." "Development projects like Lang's Resort," Caleb said. "Among other possibilities. Derek's resort would bring hundreds of jobs to Millhaven, increase tax revenue, and attract tourism that could revitalize the entire region." Victoria's presentation was clearly well rehearsed. Clinging to 19th-century solutions for 21st-century challenges isn't preservation. It's nostalgia. Morrison had been listening with growing irritation. Now he stepped forward, his voice carrying the authority of decades of Coast Guard service. "Ma'am, with respect, the Sentinel Station has provided critical navigation support for this region for more than 30 years. Modern GPS systems don't account for local weather conditions, seasonal current changes, or the specific navigation hazards that make this stretch of coast particularly dangerous." "Commander, I'm sure you believe that," Victoria replied smoothly, "but the Coast Guard's own data shows declining reliance on lighthouse navigation aids. Surely professional organizations like yours are moving toward more cost-effective, centralized monitoring systems." It was a skillful argument, and Caleb could see that Victoria had done her homework. She wasn't dismissing the lighthouse's value. She was making it seem obsolete. "Mr. Turner," Lang said, "I want to make you a revised offer. $3 million for the property, plus a guaranteed position as historical consultant for the resort's lighthouse preservation project. You'd have input on how the lighthouse is preserved and displayed, and your daughter would have her college education fully funded." $3 million. Caleb felt the familiar knot in his stomach, the one that appeared whenever he thought about Maya's future and his ability to provide for it. The offer was generous enough to solve every financial problem they'd ever had, with enough left over to secure opportunities he'd stopped allowing himself to imagine. "That's very generous," he said slowly. Maya stepped closer to him, her hand finding his arm. "Dad." "I know, honey, I know." He looked around the lighthouse, at Morrison's weathered face, at the sophisticated equipment Samuel had spent decades maintaining. "Mr. Lang, Ms. Chen, I appreciate your offer, but I need time to consider all the implications." "Of course," Lang agreed, "but I should mention that this offer has an expiration date. My investors are interested in moving forward quickly, and there are other coastal properties we're considering if this becomes too complicated." "How long?" Caleb asked. 1 week, Victoria said. "We'll need a decision by next Friday if you want to take advantage of this opportunity." After they left, Morrison helped Caleb and Maya secure the lighthouse equipment. As they worked, the commander offered his assessment. "They're not wrong about the industry changes," he said, "and $3 million is genuine financial security for your family." "But?" Maya prompted. "But they're also not right about this lighthouse being obsolete. The data Samuel collected here has prevented real emergencies, saved real lives. That's not nostalgia, that's practical value." Morrison paused in his work. "The question is whether you believe that value is worth the risk of fighting for it." As they walked back to the mansion, Maya was uncharacteristically quiet. Finally, she spoke. "Dad, what are you thinking?" Caleb looked up at the lighthouse tower, its windows now reflecting the afternoon light like watching eyes. "I'm thinking that your grandfather spent 35 years proving this lighthouse could serve modern purposes. And I'm thinking that your mother would have wanted us to honor that kind of dedication. But $3 million would solve a lot of problems," Caleb agreed. "But it wouldn't solve the problem of living with ourselves if we gave up on something important just because it was difficult." Maya smiled, and Caleb saw Rebecca's determination in her expression. "So we keep going?" "We keep going. But Maya, if this doesn't work out, if we can't get the lighthouse certified or the trust activated, I want you to know that I tried because I believe in what Samuel was protecting, not because I was chasing money." "I know, Dad. And I believe in it too." That evening, as they prepared for another night in the mansion, Caleb pulled out Samuel's letter and read the next restoration task. Unlock the keeper's words. "Truth sleeps behind carved wood and painted glass." "Carved wood and painted glass," Maya repeated. "The great hall. There's a big stained glass window in there, and all those carved panels on the walls." "Tomorrow," Caleb promised. "Tomorrow we find out what truth Samuel was trying to preserve." Outside, the wind was picking up, and the lighthouse stood dark against the evening sky. But for the first time since arriving in Millhaven, Caleb felt like they were moving in the right direction, towards something worth fighting for, whatever the cost. The great hall of the Turner mansion had clearly been designed to impress. 20-foot ceilings supported by carved wooden beams created a space that could have hosted formal receptions or community gatherings. But like the rest of the house, it had been closed off from regular use, its grandeur hidden beneath dust covers and the accumulated neglect of decades. Maya pulled away the sheets covering the furniture while Caleb examined the carved wooden panels that lined the walls. Each panel depicted maritime scenes, ships navigating treacherous waters, lighthouses guiding vessels to safety, fishermen hauling in nets heavy with the day's catch. The craftsmanship was extraordinary, clearly the work of master artisans who understood both woodworking and the sea. But it was the stained glass window that dominated the room's far wall that truly took their breath away. Rising nearly to the ceiling, the window depicted a sailing ship approaching a lighthouse positioned on a rocky headland. But this wasn't a generic maritime scene. As they studied it more closely, they realized it was a specific representation of the Millhaven coast, with the Turner Mansion's lighthouse clearly identifiable in the painted glass. "Dad, look at this," Maya called from the base of the window. She was examining the wooden frame that surrounded the stained glass. "These aren't just decorative carvings. They're symbols. The same ones we've been seeing throughout the house." Caleb joined her, running his fingers over the intricate woodwork. Compass roses, anchors, ship wheels, and other nautical motifs were carved with the same precision they'd found elsewhere, but here they seemed to follow a specific pattern. Moving from left to right around the window frame, the symbols told a story. Ships in distress, lighthouse beacons providing guidance, vessels reaching safe harbor. "It's like an instruction manual," Maya said with growing excitement. "The whole window is showing the lighthouse's purpose." "Unlock the keeper's words," Caleb read from Samuel's letter again. "Truth sleeps behind carved wood and painted glass." Maybe we need to look behind the window literally. They found a ladder in the mansion's utility room and carefully positioned it beside the great window. As Caleb climbed, Maya held the base steady and directed a flashlight beam to illuminate the window's details. From up close, the stained glass was even more remarkable. Each piece had been individually cut and lidded with the skill of a master craftsman. But as Caleb examined the window's edges, he noticed something unusual. A section of the wooden frame, about 2 feet square and positioned behind the lighthouse image, seemed to be constructed differently from the rest. "Maya, there's something odd about this part of the frame," he called down. "It looks like it might be removable." Following his daughter's guidance, Caleb found the hidden mechanism, a small brass lever concealed among the carved symbols, disguised as part of the decorative pattern. When he pressed it, a section of the frame swung outward like a small door, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth that had protected it from decades of moisture, was a leather document folder. "Got it," Caleb said, carefully extracting the folder. "Whatever Samuel hid up here, it's been waiting a long time for someone to find it." Back on solid ground, they opened the folder with the reverence of archaeologists uncovering a priceless artifact. Inside were documents that immediately explained why Samuel had been so secretive about the mansion's true purpose. The first document was the original charter of the Coastal Heritage Maritime Trust, but this was the complete version, not the partial copy Oliver had shown them at the archive. The full charter outlined not just the trust's protective mission, but its funding source and long-term strategy. "Dad, look at this section," Maya said, pointing to a paragraph near the end of the charter. "The trust wasn't just funded by shipping profits. It was endowed with the proceeds from a cargo recovery operation." Caleb read more carefully. In 1891, a cargo ship carrying gold from California to Portland had foundered on the rocks near the Turner Lighthouse. The ship was a total loss, but the Turner family and other local residents had organized a salvage operation that recovered most of the Boggshire cargo. Instead of keeping the gold, they'd used it to fund the Maritime Trust that would protect other ships from similar disasters. "They turned a tragedy into a protection system," Maya said with admiration. The second document was even more significant, a legal brief from 1987 that outlined the trust's modern legal status. According to this analysis, the trust had been structured as a perpetual foundation, meaning it would continue operating indefinitely as long as its conditions were met. But more importantly, the brief confirmed that the trust's assets had grown far beyond the original endowment. $80 million was a conservative estimate, Caleb said, reading the financial projections. With careful management, the trust could be worth more than $100 million today. But it was the third document that truly revealed Samuel's strategy. It was a detailed plan for modernizing the Maritime Trust's mission while preserving its historical foundation. Samuel had envisioned the lighthouse becoming the center of a comprehensive coastal protection program, not just providing navigation aid, but coordinating search and rescue operations, maintaining environmental monitoring systems, and supporting the local fishing industry through weather forecasting and emergency communications. He wasn't just maintaining tradition, Maya realized. He was adapting it for modern needs. The plan was sophisticated and far-reaching, with partnerships outlined with the Coast Guard, university research programs, and environmental organizations. Samuel had spent years developing a vision that would make the Maritime Trust more relevant and effective in the 21st century than it had ever been in the past. "This is what he meant by truth sleeps behind carved wood and painted glass," Caleb said. "The real truth about what this place could become." Maya was studying the final page of Samuel's plan, a detailed timeline for implementation that began with, "When the right Turner comes home." The steps were clearly laid out. Reactivate the lighthouse, establish the trustee board, present the modernization plan to the Coast Guard and partner organizations, and begin the trust's expanded mission. "Dad, we can do this," she said with growing conviction. "Everything's here. The legal framework, the partnerships, the funding. Grandpa did all the groundwork." Caleb wanted to share her optimism, but the weight of responsibility was overwhelming. "Maya, this isn't just about managing money or maintaining a lighthouse. Samuel is asking us to become the guardians of something that affects the entire community's future." "So?" Maya challenged. "Isn't that what guardianship means? Taking responsibility for something bigger than yourself?" Before Caleb could respond, they heard the sound of vehicles approaching outside. Through the Great Hall's windows, they could see multiple cars pulling into the mansion's driveway: Derek Lang's Mercedes, Iris Moreno's real estate SUV, and several other vehicles they didn't recognize. "Looks like our week of consideration just got shortened," Caleb said grimly. They quickly secured Samuel's documents and moved to the front door. Lang was approaching with what looked like a small army of supporters: Victoria Chin, Iris, several men in business suits, and a woman with a camera who was documenting everything. "Mr. Turner," Lang called as they emerged from the mansion, "I hope you don't mind the intrusion, but we've brought some people who wanted to see the property." "See it for what?" Maya asked pointedly. Preliminary site assessment, Victoria Chen replied smoothly. Since our offer expires tomorrow, we wanted to be prepared to move forward quickly if you decide to accept. Caleb felt a chill that had nothing to do with the coastal wind. Tomorrow? You said we had a week. That was before we learned about your attempts to reactivate the Maritime Trust, Lang said, his polished demeanor slipping slightly. My investors are concerned about potential legal complications. If you're serious about pursuing the trust option, we need to know now so we can consider alternative properties. And if we decide to fight for the trust, Caleb asked. Then you'll be fighting alone, one of the suited men said, stepping forward. I'm Richard Hawthorne, representing Pacific Development Associates. We filed preliminary objections to any trust reactivation with the State Maritime Commission, the Coast Guard, and the County Planning Office. On what grounds? Maya demanded. Safety concerns, environmental impact, and questions about the competency of proposed trust management, Victoria Chen replied. The Maritime Trust was designed for a different era. Attempting to reactivate it now would be both legally complex and financially irresponsible. Hawthorne pulled out a tablet and began showing them official-looking documents. We've also initiated an inquiry into the tax status of the property. If the lighthouse can't be certified as an active navigation aid within 90 days, the county assessor will be required to reclassify it as a luxury residence, which would trigger substantial tax penalties. The legal assault was clearly coordinated and comprehensive. They weren't just offering to buy the property, they were making any alternative legally and financially untenable. However, Lang said, stepping back into his role as the reasonable alternative, our offer remains open until tomorrow at 5 p.m. $3 million, cash, with all legal complications handled by our team. You could be free of this burden and financially secure within 30 days. As the group prepared to leave, Victoria Chen approached Maya directly. I know you're excited about the historical significance, but you should consider what's best for your father. He's already lost so much. Don't let romantic idealism cost him the chance to secure your future. After they'd gone, Caleb and Maya stood in the mansion's overgrown driveway, surrounded by the weight of impossible choices. The documents hidden behind the stained-glass window proved that Samuel's vision was achievable, but the forces arrayed against them seemed overwhelming. Dad, Maya said quietly, what do you want to do? Caleb looked up at the lighthouse tower, its windows reflecting the afternoon light like watching eyes. He thought about Samuel's 35 years of careful preparation, about Eleanor's family's generations of keeping, about Commander Morrison's nephew whose life had been saved by an early storm warning. I want to light the beacon, he said. One more time. If we're going to fight for this place, I want to see what Samuel saw when he stood watch. Maya smiled, understanding exactly what he meant. The fourth task, light the beacon that calls them home. As it was in the beginning, so it must be again. As it was in the beginning, Caleb repeated. Tomorrow, before we give Lang our answer, we're going to restore this lighthouse to its full purpose, even if it's just for one night. And then we decide whether we're keepers or sellers, but we'll make that decision with the light burning. As evening approached, father and daughter stood together before the mansion that had called them home, preparing for the choice that would determine not just their future, but the future of everything Samuel Turner had spent a lifetime protecting. The town hall meeting was packed beyond capacity. Word had spread through Millhaven faster than fog rolling in from the ocean. The Turner Lighthouse was going to burn again for the first time in over a year, and Derek Lang was demanding a public hearing on the Maritime Trust's legal status. Folding chairs had been set up in every available space, and people stood along, the walls, their faces, reflecting the complex emotions of a community caught between past and future. Caleb sat at a small table facing the crowd, Maya beside him, while Lang's team occupied a larger table positioned to suggest authority and resources. Victoria Chen had brought additional lawyers, and their presentation materials were stacked with the precision of a military operation. Behind them, a projector displayed architectural renderings of the proposed resort, gleaming buildings that would erase every trace of the town's maritime heritage. Eleanor Whitford sat in the front row, her hands folded over Eleanor's father's compass that Maya had returned to her that morning. Commander Morrison was beside her, wearing his dress uniform despite his retirement, representing the Coast Guard's unofficial but unmistakable support for the lighthouse's continuation. Oliver Chen sat several rows back, his expression carefully neutral as he avoided looking at his sister. But it was the presence of the fishing fleet captains that surprised Caleb most. Men and women he'd never met had come to speak about storm warnings that had guided them safely home, about weather data that had helped them avoid dangerous conditions, about the comfort of knowing that someone was watching the waters they depended on for their living. Mayor Patricia Henley called the meeting to order, her voice carrying the weariness of someone who'd presided over too many battles between preservation and progress. "We're here to discuss the proposed reactivation of the Coastal Heritage Maritime Trust and the competing development proposal for the Turner property. Mr. Lang, you requested this hearing." Lang stood, his presentation polished and professional. "Thank you, Mayor Henley. Pacific Development Associates has invested significantly in our Millhaven Resort project, which would bring 300 permanent jobs and millions in annual tourist revenue to this community." The projector displayed economic projections, artist renderings, and testimonials from other communities that had embraced luxury tourism. "The Turner property is the final piece we need to complete this vision," Lang continued. However, attempts to reactivate a 19th-century maritime trust threaten to delay or derail development that could transform this town's economic future. Victoria Chen took over, her argument carefully constructed around legal precedents and practical concerns. The Maritime Trust was designed for an era when lighthouse navigation was essential for ship safety. Modern GPS systems, satellite weather monitoring, and Coast Guard automation have made individual lighthouse stations obsolete. Attempting to reactivate the trust would be both legally questionable and financially irresponsible. She gestured toward Caleb and Maya. The proposed trustees lack the professional qualifications necessary to manage an $80 million foundation or operate sophisticated maritime equipment. This isn't about preserving history. It's about romantic idealism that ignores economic reality. The presentation was effective, and Caleb could see people in the audience nodding along with the practical arguments. 300 jobs was a lot in a town where the fishing industry had been struggling for years. Mayor Henley turned to Caleb. "Mr. Turner, you have the opportunity to respond." Caleb stood slowly, feeling the weight of every eye in the room. He didn't have professional presentation materials or economic projections. He had only the truth of what he'd discovered in his father's house, and the conviction that some things mattered more than immediate profit. 6 months ago, I was a history teacher living paycheck to paycheck trying to raise my daughter after losing my wife to cancer, he began. When I inherited my father's house, my first instinct was to sell it and secure our financial future. Derek Lang's offer would solve every problem I have. The room was completely quiet, people leaning forward to hear his words. But my father left me more than property. He left me a responsibility that 3 generations of our family have honored, watching over these waters and the people who depend on them. Caleb pulled out the documents they'd found behind the stained glass window. The Maritime Trust isn't a relic of the past. It's a foundation that has been protecting this community for more than a century, adapting to serve modern needs while preserving essential values. Maya stood beside him, her voice clear and confident as she addressed the crowd. 2 weeks ago, the Sarah's Dream got caught in a squall about 5 miles offshore. Captain Rodriguez couldn't reach Coast Guard radio because of atmospheric interference, but he could reach our lighthouse. My grandfather's weather data helped him navigate safely back to harbor. Captain Rodriguez stood from the audience. "That's true. Samuel Turner's storm warning probably saved my boat and my crew." Commander Morrison rose next. "The Sentinel Station has provided critical navigation support for this region for 35 years. The weather data Samuel collected there prevented dozens of maritime emergencies. That's not nostalgia, that's life-saving." One by one, members of the fishing community stood to share their stories. Weather warnings that had helped them avoid dangerous conditions, navigation assistance during equipment failures, emergency communications when Coast Guard systems were down. Samuel Turner's lighthouse had been quietly protecting their community long after most people thought such protection was necessary. Eleanor Whitford stood last, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd lived through decades of coastal storms. "My father kept this light burning for 34 years. Samuel's father kept it for 32 years. Samuel himself kept it for 35 years. 3 generations of keepers, watching over our waters, protecting our people." She looked directly at Lang. "Some things are worth more than tourist dollars." Lang's team attempted to counter with legal arguments about trust management and Coast Guard certification, but the room's energy had shifted. These weren't abstract economic theories. They were personal stories about a lighthouse that had touched real lives. Mayor Henley called for a recess while the town council deliberated. During the break, Oliver Chen approached his sister, their conversation tense but brief. When the meeting resumed, he stood to address the room. "I am Oliver Chen, descendant of one of the Maritime Trust's founding families. My sister has argued that reactivating the trust would be impractical and legally complex." He paused, his voice growing stronger. "But after reviewing the complete documentation that Samuel Turner preserved, I believe the Trust's mission is more relevant today than ever. Climate change has made coastal weather more unpredictable. Local knowledge and community-based navigation support are increasingly valuable." He looked directly at Caleb. "As the Chen family representative, I formally support the Trust's reactivation and volunteer to serve as the third trustee." Victoria Chen's carefully constructed legal argument crumbled in the face of her own brother's testimony. Without unanimous family opposition, her challenge to the Trust's validity lost its foundation. Mayor Henley reconvened the council for a final vote. All those in favor of supporting the reactivation of the Coastal Heritage Maritime Trust signify by saying aye. The response was overwhelming, not unanimous but clearly decisive. The town had chosen preservation over development, community heritage over tourist revenue. Lang stood abruptly, his polished demeanor finally cracking. "This is a mistake. You're choosing sentiment over economic reality. My investors won't wait for a community to come to its senses." "Then I guess they'll have to look elsewhere," Mayor Henley replied calmly. As the crowd began to disperse, Caleb felt Maya take his hand. They walked together toward the lighthouse, where Commander Morrison was waiting with the equipment needed to relight the beacon. "Ready?" Morrison asked. Caleb looked up at the lighthouse tower, its windows reflecting the evening sky. In a few hours, those windows would be blazing with light for the first time since Samuel's death, calling ships safely home, just as they had for more than a century. "Ready," he said. The Fresnel lens caught the first spark of ignition and transformed it into a beam that swept across the darkening waters. From miles offshore, fishing boats began responding with their horns, a maritime salute to the lighthouse that had guided them safely home for generations. Maya stood beside her father, Eleanor's compass warm in her hands, watching the light cut through the gathering darkness. They were keepers now, guardians of something larger than themselves, protectors of a tradition that connected past and future in an unbroken chain of service. The sea stretched endlessly before them, full of vessels that would need guidance home. And the Sentinel was ready, its light burning bright against the darkness, its watchers faithful to their trust. The watch would continue. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.